Oh yeah, baby, we're back.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
Yippee! Currently, it is March 18th, also known as Saiyan Day, which is why I'm wearing my Dragon Ball Z shirt. And today, we're going to do something that has nothing to do with Dragon Ball Z. We're going to talk about Spider-Man. So I'm going to break down for you guys what's great about it, what stinks about it, and whether or not you should buy it. Spoiler alert, you should. To get a good understanding of this omnibus, you really got to understand where Marvel was at this point with Spider-Man. So Spider-Man had been married for a little while to Mary Jane, and she was pregnant at the time. And Marvel started to begin to feel that their readers were not relating to Spider-Man as much. You know, Spider-Man has always been one of the most relatable characters in comics, at least for me and a lot of other people. And so I think what's interesting about it is this is not a problem that Marvel was going to solve with the character of Ben Reilly, and one that they were going to continue to deal with for the next 30 years, and they're still trying to figure out today. This is coming off the heels of a reboot of sorts of Spider-Man, because what they ultimately decided to do was they felt like, okay, Peter Parker's married, he's unrelatable at this point to a lot of people, but we can't undo his marriage. Like,
that wasn't
Challenge accepted.
that's not in the character of Peter. He wouldn't get divorced, so what should we do? Aha, someone said. It was a terrible transition. So somebody thought, I know, we'll take the old clone story where there was a story in early Spider-Man where Spider-Man faces off against a clone, they fight over the smokestack, and one of the clones gets knocked down the smokestack and dies. Well, ultimately, what they decide is that clone never died. Instead, that clone wandered the U.S. for 5 years, as 5 years in the 616 Marvel Universe passed, and ended up discovering that, spoiler alert to the Clone Saga Omnibus, if you haven't read that, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but that character, Ben Reilly, who thought he was the clone, turned out to be the real original Spider-Man. And what this did at the time was it created a big friction with the old fans, because they're like, wait, our character, our Spider-Man is Peter Parker. He's not this other guy, Ben Reilly. Like, I don't understand who is the guy that I've been reading for all this time. So Marvel didn't really feel like they could kill him off because they knew so many fans had grown attached to the character. And so ultimately they gave him this sweet, wonderful ending where he discovers he's the clone, hangs up the webs, and him and Mary Jane move off to Portland to have a baby. Meanwhile, they bring in Ben, who thought he was a clone. They've established is the real Peter Parker, and he comes back to New York, and he's single, and he's broke and trying to make it, but they felt like this would be a more relatable Spider-Man for people to grab a hold of. And ultimately, I think it actually worked pretty well. You know, at the time, I know, again, a lot of older fans hated it because they didn't like the idea that the character they had been reading was not the original Spider-Man, and they felt like this was a slight to them, and they weren't going to really get on board with Ben Reilly. But one of the great parts about reading this, as we have the ability to look through the lens of time, is we know that this doesn't stick, and so we're able to kind of enjoy it for what it was. And I think that alone makes this omnibus and this story much more enjoyable than it might have been at the time it came out. So if you were a person who hated it when it came out, or you didn't like the idea when it came out, you thought it was dumb they were replacing Peter Parker, I would say give this another try. Knowing that it doesn't stick makes it better to me. So as this book picks up, it picks up off of the Clone Saga conclusion, and Ben Reilly, like I mentioned before, finds himself as Spider-Man with not a dollar to his name and only one friend. We pick up with him in what is one of the raddest costumes of all time, right? Look at this. That's super dope, dude. I love the Scarlet Spider costume. And I'm going to be honest with you, the story in the first few arcs was really not that great. When I picked up this book, I was excited to read it, and some of the stories were just very 90s, very disjointed. There are a lot of good writers on this book. We got like DeZago, DeFalco. I thought there'd be more of a list here. This is embarrassing. Yikes. But it does not start off strong. So it starts off with Ben as Scarlet Spider-Man, and he gets a job working at a restaurant, but he's working for this crime boss, and he ends up becoming a bodyguard. And really the story's kind of a convoluted mess. There's a lot about virtual reality in here, which is really funny because the Virtual Boy came out in the 90s, and like VR, everybody kind of thought was the future. And now we have VR and it's okay. Like, I'm not a big fan. But in this story, his best friend gets trapped in the virtual world as an internet surfer.
I intend to find out. Reboot!
And he surfs the internet and helps Ben stop the new Dr. Octopus, which is his friend Mr. Trainer's daughter. There's this whole story arc where Ben is trying to balance being the bodyguard for this crime boss and figure out what's going on, and there's introductions of new villains and old villains. One of the storylines, though, that sticks through this book, and one of the things I like about this book, is the writers, even though there's a bunch of different writers and it jumps from series to series to different writers, I think sometimes it can work really well because you have a lot of good writers giving a lot of good input on a story. And one of the things they introduced in this was basically this idea of a great game where there's all these billionaires.
Billionaires,
Where they have decided to basically place bets on heroes. They each sponsor a hero or a villain, and they recruit them to their team, and they go out and fight other heroes, and they place bets on who's going to win. Basically just a way for them to spend money. And that's a story that kind of follows through this whole book, and it's really fun. They introduced a new character named Joystick and a couple other interesting characters. But really, that was the standout to me from this first little bit, as Ben is the Scarlet Spider. Look at this great Ramita artwork. Oh, yeah, that's good. That's good quality artwork, yeah. Not a good job holding the book up like that. So once he decides to finally go back to being Spider-Man and not the Scarlet Spider through some semi-lame, contrived story plot line, the book really takes off. I mean, seriously, it gets so good. You guys ever seen the show Becker? Came on in the 90s. It was a really fun show with Ted Danson where he played a doctor. Well, he went to this diner all the time, and at this like little local diner, coffee shop, there was a recurring cast of characters, and I swear, I don't know if this came out before Becker or if Becker came out before this, but one of them copied the other, because Ben gets a job as kind of like a waiter at this diner, and it's really fun. There's a really good core cast of characters that they give him. They're all new. And it really lets Ben stand on his own as Spider-Man, and that makes the book really fun. So then he begins to try to balance his life and the people he's meeting and his love life, which we all know he's got that Parker luck. Speaking of Parker, the one biggest complaint that I have about this omnibus, well, there's a few complaints I have about the omnibus. One of them is that you got to be willing to put up with Ben constantly re-explaining his situation. Like, there's a lot of team-ups in this book. The pacing is not always great. The main stories with Ben as Spider-Man are awesome, but they interject a lot of other offshoot series, like a Venom story, a Punisher series. There's a crossover with Silver Surfer, which is actually pretty freaking sweet. But when they do that, every time Ben's like, my name is Peter Parker, but I can't go by Peter Parker now. I have to go by Ben Reilly because my clone lived my life for 5 years, etc., etc. He's constantly retelling you this. So that was a bit of an annoyance from someone who's reading all of the stories at once. But I will say it was worth it because the stories were fantastic. So as he transitions to Spider-Man, we get some really fun and good stories. He designs a new costume, which I freaking loved. Let me tell you, it definitely makes an upcoming video, the top 5 Spider-Man costume list of all time. It definitely makes that. So you see here, we got the crossover with Punisher. The art was overall pretty good. Spoiler alert for the rest of my review. There's an interesting miniseries with Venom. You know, one of the things I really liked about this series is a lot of the characters know Spider-Man and think he's Peter Parker, but Ben doesn't have any history of these characters because he hasn't been around for 5 years. And so that's a really fun dynamic to play with and to read. Like, look at that cover. I'm just a big fan of some of these covers here. I'm getting ahead of myself too much. So there's some really good stories. There's a sweet story about him helping a guy in a gang turn over his life, and there's a Mysterio story that was really fun. One of my highlights for this book, though, was when he meets Black Cat, because Black Cat and Peter Parker had quite the steamy relationship, and
You must think I'm a fool.
I think you are incredible.
to see where they take it with Ben is fun and interesting. So we get some really good stories, and in the middle of all that's going on with Ben, we get a story that is about Peter Parker, and it's called Peter Parker: The Final Days. And we cut over to Peter and living his life in Portland, Oregon, and there's a little bit of a tie-in to how he got his powers and a question about if he should use his powers and help people, and Mary Jane doesn't want him to use his powers anymore because he's going to be a father, so she wants him to hang up the webs. And I thought it was a really cool story. It really showed their dynamic pretty well, and it was nice to throw in there. And finally, once we get back to the action, we begin to wrap up some of the plot lines that had been developed in this book. But my favorite story of all time as a kid, well, not my absolute favorite, but one of my favorite stories of all time, is a story called Web of Carnage. And man, I love that story. So they bring back the character of Kane, who's in the Clone Saga. He's a failed clone of Peter Parker, who he's an assassin, and he comes back, and he mixes it up with the guys and all that stuff. But ultimately Carnage gets out, and we get the new character Spider Carnage, which as a fourth grader I thought was freaking amazing. I thought it was so rad that we had Spider Carnage. Here, let me see if I can find a good picture of Spider Carnage for you guys to see. I mean, it is just, look at this. Let's see if we can get it up here. Look at that. Spider Carnage is awesome. So the Carnage symbiote bonds with Ben Reilly, and he has to figure out how to get rid of it. It's a really fun story, and ultimately the climax of all these stories is it is discovered at the bottom of the smokestack that he and Peter, who we believe is the clone at the time, at the bottom of the smokestack where they fought and one of the clones supposedly died, they find a body in a Spider-Man costume that turns out to be a match for Peter Parker. So it just throws a huge kink in everyone's plans, and it really makes everyone begin to question, like, wait, who is the clone? Who's not the clone? I'm very confused. So it's a really good book with a really good, some good scenery, good supporting cast. Peter has a really interesting love interest who has a dark secret about her family that ties into the origin story of Spider-Man that was really fun. I found the story to be mostly good. The parts of the story that came just from the Spider-Man book itself were fantastic. Some of the team-ups were hit or miss. The first story arc was not great, very 90s, but ultimately extremely fun, extremely new reader friendly. And I think for what it is, to take Spider-Man, or in this case Ben Reilly, and to put him in a young, fresh setting with a new supporting cast, it just felt really fun to me. It felt really fresh. I get why Marvel tried to do it. I understand why it ultimately didn't work, but I thought it was really fun. And I think now, knowing that you're not going to be forced to live with this character forever, I think for what it is, you can enjoy it greatly. Now, the artwork is fantastic in this book. For the most part, you got artists like Romita Jr., I think I mentioned this earlier, Romita Jr., Bagley. You got Klaus Jensen doing some work in here. Overall, it was really strong. There was a few issues where I felt like the art was lacking, but for the most part, it was great, whoever the artist was. I felt like they really captured it. As a 90s kid, I absolutely love Romita Jr. on Spider-Man. That's some of my favorite Spider-Man art, so I loved seeing him here doing some of these books, but it was really rad. I really liked the art overall. It did not detract from the story. It almost always added to the story, and I think that's important when it comes to art. Finally, did I find this book compelling? The answer is absolutely I did. A few of the arcs, I was able to put the book down and not think about coming back to it for a while, but by the end of the book, I was engrossed. I mean, the last 2 to 3 arcs, probably the last 12 issues or so of the main series, I was just like, I cannot stop reading this. This is so good. This is so interesting, and it's so fun. I got to know how they're going to resolve these storylines. One of the great parts about the book is it leaves it on a little bit of a cliffhanger. So there's going to be a second omnibus. And with that, I say, You need to pick this up. Clone Saga Volume 2, as of now, is very out of print, very hard to find. This is a book they're not going to reprint. I can almost guarantee it because it's not popular enough. It's not in demand enough. There's way better books to reprint before this one in terms of what people really want. So if you're at all interested in reading Ben Reilly, a new fresh take on Spider-Man set in the 90s with great art, decent story, and fun crossovers, you got to get this book. You got to give it a try. Forget the haters. Forget the preconceived notions. Give it a try. You won't be disappointed. See you again in a few years. I'm out. It's really hard to start a video when you haven't done one in a long time. Oh, hello there. You thought I was dead, but I'm alive. Hey, gang, I'm Johnny Cool. No, that's the wrong channel. Spider-Man, Spider-Man does whatever a spider can.